Uh, hello again. Um, thanks for being here. Um, you already know who I am, so let's
I have some new people this time.
let's see. Oh, okay. Well, I'm that's true. That's true. I'm Jim Ezacolo. I'm a proposal writer and editor, although I don't really write because you don't want me writing your science. And research development strategist from CU Boulder Research and Innovation Office. Um, I've been at CU now for going over 5 years, about 5.5 years at this point. I arrived just in time for the pandemic, so that was fun. Um, and as it says here, I review proposals going to those agencies, but also like any agency, pretty much. You got an agency, I'll review it. That includes foundations and all that kind of good stuff. So let's see. Well, I don't know if I pressed that. Okay. Yes. Okay. So we sort of went through, I guess you could call it preliminary things in the last session, but they help set a foundation for how to think about proposal writing. And one of the things that we discussed is the following here, right? What reviewers, your readers, are looking for. They are looking for these questions, right? Specifically, they're looking for how you answer these questions and if you address these questions at all, right? These questions I've modified a bit. I may have added one or two, but they primarily come from what's called the Heilmeyer Catechism. And if you were raised in the Roman Catholic Church, you certainly know what a catechism is, right? But it's basically a bunch of rules you need to follow. Okay, this comes from a guy dead, long dead now, George Heilmeyer. Before there was DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, there was George Heilmeyer who ran what came before DARPA, and then he ran DARPA. He was the first director of DARPA, if I believe. And he basically told the people under him who were receiving proposals and reading them, he said, listen, he said, anybody who's writing your proposal, they've got to answer these questions. They have to answer them directly and clearly. Now, that doesn't mean Heilmeyer was looking for one sentence explanations and that's it. However, Heilmeyer wanted clear, direct answers right up front. And then you would go through and, if you will, I'll say pick over, but in a nice way, you'd pick over the science. You'd look at the arguments for it. And that sort of goes with what I discussed last time we were here, which is get to the stuff that needs to be discussed first. In other words, you're going to have to answer these questions. And yes, proposals come in different parts, different sections, right? That said, you're most likely going to be beginning your sections, whatever they may be, with some kind of attempt to answer either one of these specific questions or a combination of these questions, right? You're not expected to be able to provide, one-page overview for every section. But what you're doing is you're letting your audience, your readers, your reviewers know what to expect when they go forward. And that's key. And we mentioned that a little bit the last time, but we'll hammer it home today. So again, right, all of these convey the point, these answers, or the takeaway. You then proceed to lay out the context of the argument, which supports here the claim, because I'm speaking argument speak, but the answer's here. So there's many terms for this, the getting to the point. This is taken from, I took this from Carnegie Mellon, but bottom line up front, or BLUF, may not be the best acronym, because when you're bluffing, you're kind of lying. But remember BLUF. It's either, give them the takeaway immediately or bottom line up front. We already talked about what the goal is as a writer, right? Rationally persuade. Clear, yes, but also efficient. Reviewers need to quickly grasp your ideas, right? They at least need to quickly grasp your main idea, right? We're specifically talking about sort of the bottom line up front, right? They need to know what the bottom line is up front at the beginning of documents, sections, and paragraphs. Now, here I have a couple of, well, one example, really. Example paragraph on the left here, which I won't read through. It takes a lot longer and is not as clear as this section, right? And this also serves as actually a good way, a good rubric for how you should write captions for your figures or tables, right? Just very quickly, first sentence of a caption, tell the reader exactly what they're supposed to get from it, right? And then, yes, of course, they will read it, but telling them exactly what they're supposed to get from it, for example, in this one, it lets them know, oh, all of what I'm looking at here is supposed to do what? Support what's said in this first sentence, right? And again, there is also something to be said for constructing your writing, your proposal, to help ease not just reading, but what I refer to as scannability, right? Sometimes I've been told reviewers will scan the proposal before they really dig down deep, right? Well, you certainly don't want them to scan the proposal and get confused at the scanning part. Granted, they're not expecting, in-depth arguments when they're scanning, but they scan to follow the general flow, right? They're looking at, or they may be looking at section titles, subsection titles, headings, captions, and so on, right? This is just very quickly emphasizing that when you're writing, you're telling a story, something we hit upon the last time. I'd say, while this is primarily directed towards fiction, okay, a lot of this is very applicable. And I won't go over each stage because it's a lot. And believe me, I can't draw better than that. And that's not saying much because most of it's stick figures, but still, it looks a lot better than what I could do. But take a chance and look at it, right, when you have the time. Because we've already talked about things like, right, start at the end. It's all about structure. You really get that today. Put the human in the center. Now you may think, depending on your field, well, that may be kind of difficult. But I mean, most of you here, I'm assuming, ultimately we're talking about how it affects humans, right? And ultimately, a lot of times that's why things may get funded, right? That element needs to be there. Here, right, empathize with your audience. That could be understood as, hey, know what your audience is looking for, right? So gives you an idea of how, well, the actual titling of the little bit may seem to not apply. What do you mean I have to empathize with my audience, right? Well, one, you need to know what they're looking for, how they read. Plus two, and I saw this in the comments when people did their surveys, there was at least one or two instances where individuals said, I never really considered what the reviewer was going through. And I was sort of surprised, but then I said, well, I'm glad that I at least talked about it, right? I mean, some people were like, I never really thought that they were human beings, and not in a bad sense, but they tend to be seen as an obstacle, right? That you have to get through, a hoop you have to get through. So that's another reason, right, why we are emphasizing a persuasive stories. Stories engage people, okay? And you are starting at the end of your story, what you're supposed to be delivering, the importance of what you're delivering, and so on, right? These elements need to be part of that story and need to be addressed in that persuasive outcome, right? That persuasive story. Obviously, the agency or program need. The story itself is the research narrative, whatever the agency considers to be the narrative parts. Sometimes it's called the research strategy, right? Even elements such as like, NSF project summary and so on. I consider that part of the research, the story, right? All of it combines to help tell the story. There's a project overview, right? Summary and research strategy. That's what I'm talking about here when we're talking about the narrative parts, right? We're talking about the research narrative, project overview summary, research strategy. Sometimes, yes, other sections like facilities and resources and so on definitely support the story you want to tell and your argument, right? But ultimately, unless you're going for like instrumentation or that kind of stuff, where yes, facilities and resources might loom a little larger, you're emphasizing these things, right? How you structure it affects reader engagement and understanding, obviously influences the review. Please remember, I think I talked about it last time, you need to make sure you highlight your expertise while you're telling your story here, and the expertise of any collaborators, right, or team members, okay? That's important because one of the things they're funding ultimately is your ability as an investigator. They're funding you because you are making an argument that you and the project you're presenting can give them something they want. And I very often see investigators writing a proposal who will say something like, we will use this lab on the chip device or something like that, lab on a chip device. And because I know these individuals for a while now, I say, oh, didn't you make that lab on the chip device yourself? And they go, well, yeah. And I go, well, make sure you say that, right? You don't have to say, I'm the best thing since sliced bread because I made this and I got, 10 different special awards from it and people bow at my feet as I pass by them. If there are any of those type of awards, let me know, I'll apply. But you need to let them know at any point, if you want to call it like a soft reinforcement of your ability, let them know throughout the narrative your capabilities, your accomplishments, possibly your strengths, and the strengths of others, particularly if it's collaborative. Okay, particularly if it's collaborative, because on collaborative proposals, they want to know how well people can work together. Now, sometimes you have a collaboration where you haven't really worked together first or ever, right? But obviously, you've discussed things, right? Anything that can go to show that you worked well together and, if you will, produced something, right? Or achieved something, you need to stress, you need to emphasize. Okay, we talked about this a little bit last time. We mentioned the basic building block being sentences. Sentences start with an opening, tension builds. Well, maybe in like fiction, right? But in other words, something has to go on with the opening or the subject. Then there's a verb, right? Something happens to the subject or the subject does something. And then there's a resolution. Something new comes about. Your key conceptual points when you're telling this story, they must appear throughout the research strategy to connect the various sections and form a complete story. Key conceptual points are things like necessity of the research, the project goal, the impact, innovation, etc. Right? And obviously also they can be informed by review criteria. And honestly, they will be. You should have them be informed by the review criteria, right? But usually this stuff is at the very least implied, right? That's why I am making it explicit here. You need to make sure these conceptual points appear throughout. And you may say, well, what if I'm just writing a section on preliminary data? Why do I have to try to try to connect it to, I don't know, the necessity of the research. Simple answers as to why you do that. When you are connecting things back to these key conceptual points, you are illustrating to the reader or reviewer that you know that they connect and that they're important. Also, it always helps to remind the reader of the bigger picture sometimes. And you might think, well, they're the reviewer. Don't they have the bigger picture? Well, yes. And it doesn't hurt to remind them because you're telling them a story. It's not as if, I'm a kind of a big nerd or geek, whatever you want to call it, right? I love the Lord of the Rings, okay? Trilogy. Some of you may have seen the movies, right? It's all about destroying this ring, okay? Now, if Tolkien just mentioned the ring in the first book and never mentioned it again until the last book, right? You'd kind of be wondering, well, what's going on? Why does the ring drop out of the picture? You know, how does the ring connect to the events that are going on? And so on, right? Through the rest of the books. So you're reminding the reader that you know the consequences of this. You know the importance of this. And when you're talking about your project, you're showing them that you know how it connects, okay? One easy way to do this is to make sure your headings and subheadings, okay, essentially offer a bottom line up front. Whoops, sorry about that. It's not always the easiest thing to do right off the top of your head. This is why we take our time to write and we write drafts. But having a heading or a subheading that basically tells the reader in no more than 2 sentences, ideally one, that this is what's going on in this section and why it's important and how I'm doing it. That's key because it not only helps you structure your section, it tells the reader / reviewer that this is what I'm going to be talking about. So then they know what to look for. So you better make sure you talk about that stuff. And also, it helps with scannability, particularly if you're going through a review process where it will eventually hit reviewers who have never read the full proposal before, okay? Because even if they have something like a project summary to look at, they'll get the full proposal as well. Having those informative substantive headings and subheadings will help keep the big picture in mind and reinforce those key points. Well-written paragraphs will also do this, obviously, okay? And we talked about how sentences are the basic structure, right? How new information is presented at the end of sentences. We talked about Gopin and mental breaths, right? And Gopin also says, you're responsible for creating a structure that aids the reviewer interpretation, which includes meeting their expectations as reviewers and readers. The basic structure, right, is OCAR, which stands for Opening, Challenge, Action, Resolution. It was that little graphic that was in the upper right of the last slide. However, for those of you who benefit from, let's say, not just acronyms, but sort of the structural approach, if you will, almost, I mean, like, I'll say it's logical, but these, what we're talking about here, right? And I'll just click through them. These aren't like mathematical equations all the time, right? Meaning you don't just plug in the stuff and it results in something. Obviously, you have to write, you have to review, you have to revise. But also, as you see, right, there's a number of different ones. Sometimes you will want to use these paragraph structures at different junctures, okay? At different parts of a section. Now, a lot of that comes down to, well, how do I know how to do that? Write a lot. Read other people's proposals if they let you, right? And see if they conform to these structures or not. these structures, right? OCAR, what I'm calling ABDCE, action, background, development, climax, end. LDR, lead, development, resolution, and then lead development. These aren't the final say-so in paragraph structuring, okay? Not. These are being offered to help individuals who may, in some ways, not know how to begin, all right? Not know where to start. They're also useful in looking back and seeing, am I making sense, right? Am I telling the reader, if you will, what the end is, the resolution, right? Or the development. As we go through these, you'll see that some of what's here winds up getting sucked up, right, into one of these designations as we move forward. Very often, right, the lead here is going to be, the action and the background, right? In other words, what we're talking about, why it's important, right? We'll go through these and see. Keep in mind, as we go through them, they may not appear immediately clear, right? If that's due to me, you let me know. And also, they may not appear immediately clear because I don't want to say few of you have probably ever thought about writing this way, but I bet not a lot of you have thought about writing this way. This is all presented in an attempt to give you something more than just, you want to get funding, write a proposal, and then that's it. And then that's all you hear. And there's no more guidance. This is an attempt. It's not the only way, but it's a way to give you guidance. Now, while I said that, a lot of these, right, terms, right, like opening challenge, right, sometimes an action may sometimes fall under just action here, all right? One thing you should notice, hopefully, is that, oh my gosh, the letters become fewer and fewer as we go down the line, right? There's a reason for that, and the reason is because of these things. Each one of these paragraph structures has different qualities of momentum, how the reader's reading through it, right? How quickly one reads through it. Engagement, how long it takes, honestly, to sort of get to the point, right? And investment. In other words, not only is the reader engaged, but they see, right, how important it is. They're starting to become invested in what? The overall project. So it basically goes like this. And the colors may not be the greatest, right? But we're going from slowest on top to fastest, okay? So keep that in mind because I'll be giving examples of each one of these, right? It starts off slow. Engagement starts off slowly, right? Because you're presenting things slowly. I don't mean like snail's pace, but you're presenting things very much in a step-by-step basis, multiple steps. Therefore, it takes a while to become invested. But as things go quicker and you're presenting things earlier or in a more compact fashion, all of this speeds up. So if you're thinking about, I need to write a project summary, it has to be 1 page. Well, the opening paragraph is very important of a project summary. You also know that you only have 1 page and you need to get to other things, right, in that 1 page. So you may not want to do that structure for your opening paragraph, okay? You could. I'm not saying you can't. But based upon how much space you have, what else you need to get to, the fact that this is a project summary document and you immediately want to, if you will, win them over, so to speak, you may want to go quicker, right? You may want to adopt a different structure. And that's what I'm getting at in talking about these structures and emphasizing that you can't think of writing in terms of combining these structures, right? So you're expressing things clearly and getting your point across. So we talk about OCAR, and I will read this one because it's goofy, okay? Now, if you notice up here, right, you know, and I have picked like the most sickly colors imaginable. I apologize. They really are like puke-inducing, most of them. All right. But here, right, the colors correspond to the part of the paragraph, right? Opening. Urinalysis testing is, and I didn't set that up just because it's urinalysis testing. Urinalysis testing is a commonly used diagnostic test, right? Used by healthcare professionals for finding disease and infection. Uromycetitis is a serious infection. See here, think back to new information, right? We're talking about an infection, right? Okay, let's keep talking about infection. Whoops. Uromycetitis is a serious infection. See how it connects. You don't necessarily have to reference uromycetitis here, right? Uromycetitis is a serious infection of the lower urinary tract, resulting in long-term negative health outcomes for the 1% of adult males in the United States affected each year. Early urine screening and diagnosis is critical to increasing the survival rate of uromycetitis. The opening, and honestly, a little bit of the challenge, right? It sets up the challenge. What sets up the challenge? This, early urine screening and diagnosis. Okay, but the real challenge is this. If untreated, it can cause acute renal failure. That's never good. And has a high associated mortality. Current urinalysis testing, ding, 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 you're providing what's the current state of the art, whatever it may be. You're helping set up a comparison and contrast between what's gone on before in attempting to address a problem, right? What's currently going on. You're establishing this so you can talk about how you're going to do things differently, right? Current urinalysis testing is unreliable. Unfortunately, the reagents used on dipstick analysis tests, SOMA-D, right, which are the current ones, it should say that, has difficulty detecting the bacterial cast of Costanzococcus georgius, right, the causal pathogen for uromycetitis. As a result, okay, these tests often produce false negatives, the infection allowing the infection to go undiagnosed and progress. Not good. What do we need to do about that? Our project involves the development of a multi-step chemical synthesis to produce the reagent, which will improve the detection of, right, the bacterial casts, which will do what? Resolution, lead to a greater reliability of dipstick tests for the early detection and subsequent treatment of uromycetitis. What's implied there, which if you have room and you could also add on is, which will help potentially save lives, right? Why? Well, because of that and renal failure. Okay, obviously none of you are biologists, or I'm assuming most of you aren't biologists, right? That's okay. If you're looking at this and go, A, I don't understand this, I'm not a biologist, or B, this may sound kind of funky, but I'm following it, right? I mean, I can't do a show of hands because there's like 3 people in the audience. It wouldn't be worth it. But, you know, if you read this and you go, I may not know necessarily what it's saying, but I'm able to follow it logically, that's the point. And that's the point because I totally made this up, okay? It's based off of a Seinfeld episode where Jerry has to pee in a garage and he gets caught peeing in public garage and he tries to get out of it by saying that he has uromycetitis poisoning and he could die, right? And that's also funny, right? I mean, if you've got to go, at least go in the public garage, not in Times Square hotel lobby. Haha, funny, yes. I do this first to show you, A, you can follow along, right? I mean, very rarely does somebody say after I go through that, I didn't really follow along. You're able to follow along. You still have questions about what some of this stuff may mean, but that's natural, right? Because you may not be a biologist, right? Or a chemist. But if you are a biologist or a chemist, you probably go, this is a bunch of BS, but I still follow it. So folks, the takeaway from this is not to write false narratives to get funding. It's the following. If I, Jim Esicolo, somebody with degrees in history, philosophy, and political science, can write something that you can follow and sounds like it means something, you, people who actually know things, can certainly write these paragraphs and get your point across. This is where I usually stop for applause, but okay. Oh, thank you. Oh my God, Mary threw flowers at my feet. You can't see it, it's not on screen. So keeping that in mind, let's look through these other structures and see how quickly it sets up sort of that uromycetitis narrative and so on, and see how it sometimes can be written differently. Okay, ABDCE, action, background, development, climax, end. All right, you can see things are taking a different tact. Okay, you're starting off with what? What you're doing first, right? The action here is a little different, right? The action here is what we're doing, what the project is. In many ways, this is what? Much more direct. Somebody who reads this knows exactly right off the start what your project's about, right? We go through, okay, that's bottom line up front. After bottom line up front, you have what? Background. Development. Climax, right? Which is the climax of what? The development part, right? And the background part. Then we get to the end, right? Successful development of Ketracel Black and its use on dipstick tests will improve reliability in the early detection and subsequent treatment of uromycetitis. First, and I neglected to say this, none of these are perfect, okay? Because I wrote them, but also, there's always improvement, right? There's always improvement. And you could probably looking at this right now and saying, well, I wouldn't do it that way, or maybe I would change that word or so on. Okay, right? That said, okay, you are setting up everything, or mostly everything, in that first sentence, right? Or sometimes first couple of sentences, okay? Then the rest is what I call, and not very technically, unpacking, right? You're unpacking this. Oops. You're unpacking this. And even this, right? While it, if you will, is the result of talking about this, right? The background, development, and climax, the end also ties back to this. Look for the logical structure, see how things support, your statements support each other, how they lead to the next sentence, and the story that's told, if you will, from that paragraph. Let's go again. LDR, right? Lead development resolution. You can see, okay? Again, there are similarities, but there are also some differences between what we just talked about, the ABDCE. You have this, that's very, right? That's your lead, okay? It's very similar. But then the development has some differences about the way things proceeded from the previous one, previous structure, okay? The resolution is fairly similar, but you can see we're packing a lot more in here, right? Let me go back a second, right? Look at the length. There are certain things that are left out, right? You may go, well, why? Why did you leave it out? Well, what if it's really not important at this stage to talk about percentages, right? It usually is almost always important to talk about percentages and statistics, but sometimes, let's say if you just talked about it in the paragraph prior, you probably don't need to reinforce it or state it again, okay? So lead development resolution, okay? Much quicker. It compresses things a bit, right? Makes things a little more bite size. Then LD, and you can see LD is like the most, I'll say, basic in the sense that like it's cramming lots of things together in two different parts, right? This project does this, which will improve this, enabling this, right? You could see that's almost a run on sentence, right? It's very long. But these are the type of sentences you may be forced to write when you're trying to write, oh, I have to say what this thing is in 30 lines or less, right? Or I'm only allowed to use 3 sentences, right, for this portion of the proposal that I have to submit. Lead, lots of things fall under it. Development, right? Lots of things fall under it. I think I deliberately tried to write this one like with like 4 or less sentences because very often you'll get to one of these, like NSF. Tell us what it is about using 3 sentences. And invariably people try to use like 100-word sentences, right? Which you shouldn't. That's way too long, right? But that's an example of, oh, what structure should I use in this section or for this portion, right? Again, they're presented as guides. These are, what I present here are guidelines. They're not hard and fast rules where if you don't follow them, you'll never write well, okay? Remember that this is primarily pitched to people who have like, write a proposal? What? Like, I've never done that before. But even if you have written proposals before, these can help you possibly, right, refine or hone your writing, okay? Particularly if you're reviewing your own writing, because you'll begin to look for things like, okay, am I getting to the point as quickly as possible, right? At the end of one paragraph, am I setting up, if you will, the necessary, infrastructure so that when I move to the next paragraph, people have an idea of what they're going to get or see or read, right? So all of these things, right? This maybe hopefully is another decent payoff slide, right? Hopefully, right? If not, I get put in a box, right? By series, but right? Project summary, research strategy, right? Page count varies. There are different what? Different section, requirements per aid, right? Depending on the agency, okay? This can give you an idea of how maybe you want to structure these things using what we just talked about. Am I saying you must do it, these things? No, right? But this is a way to show you how these things may show up as you write a proposal, right? So think about it. The et cetera covers a lot, right? That's like anything else. It's not these. So I apologize about that, right? But think about what's important in terms of the significance or background, right? You could afford a little bit of a slower approach, depending what? Depending on how many pages you have, right? I mean, yeah, you may want to use this slower approach if you've got a 15 or 20 or 25 page proposal. If you've got a 5-page proposal, you may need to go with some of these, right? Because you've got 5 pages and you have to do significance, innovation, that, and maybe something else, right? This is, and if you can't see what that is, that's supposed to be like knitting or weaving, all right? This all comes together, right? Each one of them being like highfalutin metaphor or analogy. Each is like one strand in a tapestry that you're weaving together, right? Like I've never done any weaving in my life. I've done some knitting horribly, right? But even if you're knitting, right, you have to make sure that things connect together, right? Like you finish one row, right? The next row has to somehow connect to the row that you just finished. How well you do it depends on how tight the rows are together or how loose they are from one another. Think back to what we talked about earlier today in terms of reinforcing main points. key conceptual ideas as well. Because when you're talking about things like your methodology, there are times where you may want to do a one sentence thing about, and here's how it hits the significance, or here's the innovative part again of my methodology, right? And so on. You folks, okay, you are essentially the tour guide, right? And I could only find one with a female identifying tour guide. It's a little stereotypical, right? But you're the tour guide. Who are these people? They're your readers, they're your reviewers, okay? I have never been on, well, I think once I've been on a guided tour. On a guided tour, do you meet the tour guide and they go, all right, see you in 4 hours? It may depend on the tour, but it was not really a guided tour, right? They're just there to make sure you don't die or fall down some sort of like architectural like thing or hole in the ground, right? You are in control of this. When we talked about last session, right? You are in control of the writing. It's the only thing you're in control of ultimately or fully, right? You are leading these readers by the hand and telling them through clear structure and efficient writing, things that we've kind of talked about, you are leading them and going, okay, this is the innovation, and here's why it's important. All right, now follow me. Okay, here is a reinforcement of significance. Okay, see how it ties back here. Here we move to a next section, and I'm letting you know what it's about because I've given you a very informative or substantive section heading or section title, right? And so on. You grab them by the hand or like under the nostrils or whatever, and you guide them along. You want folks to do this. You're creating the highway. There are signposts on the highway, right? You're letting them know that signposts are coming up, what the signposts say, and what's coming up after the next signpost, if you're following me. Clear, efficient, like very, linear, right? Logical. You want to do this. You don't want to basically construct a maze for them where they are hitting those things like those reading roadblocks. Remember we talked about like reading whiplash where they get to the end of a sentence and get to the end of a paragraph and go, huh? What? I have to reread this. Never good, right? Never good that they have to reread things because they didn't understand what you're saying, right? Rereading to gain a better appreciation for what you're saying is different than rereading because they had no idea what you're trying to get at, okay? Straight, clear pathways that you give them, and you can do this through writing. A lot of the time, this will involve, I'm still a big believer in this, outlining. Before you start writing, right? And I'll talk a little about some tips here later on. But before you start writing, outline. Think about what your key conceptual points are, right? Write them down. Figure out in what order they need to go in, okay? That's at least a first good step. That'll help you at least not give them a maze, okay? When you give them a maze where you fail to, let's say, tell them, new information is appearing at the end of a sentence, okay? And you don't follow up on it, you're giving them incomplete arcs, okay? Remember the story arc, right? OCAR. You're giving them incomplete arcs. In other words, you're not giving them, right, the information that they need. You're basically giving them, I guess, I don't know how many people are familiar with Mad Libs, right? Okay. You're basically giving them a Mad Lib proposal, right? Where you may think they will know what you want to say, but you never assume that they know, right? Because there's a big difference between, I don't know, Becca held the blank down under the water, right? They may say Becca held the person down under the water, right? Well, no, Becca held the container under the water. You want to be as clear and as explicit as possible. I'm getting looks like Becca does that, man. You don't cross Becca. But you give them complete ideas, right? Think again about our structures. Think again about where new information is presented and so on. When you give incomplete story arcs, you miss parts of the story, right? You get incoherent or incomplete thoughts. You lose direction. Remember, we want to be going one step, one step, one step, one step, right? It's sometimes okay to be like one step, one step. We're spending some time here. We're spending some time here. I'm letting you know we're going to the next step. That's fine. It's a totally different thing when you go, we're moving here. I'm going here now. I'm going here now. Whoop, I moved two things back. Whoop, did I start here? Right? You probably never wanted to see me move that much in the presentation. However, right, no obvious direction. Your internal structure is confusing, most likely if you have an incomplete arc. And what? No points of clear emphasis, right? But it's amazing how many like free graphics images there are of confused people. I noticed there's lots. A confused reviewer is working harder to understand your proposal, right? Why? Well, think about what we talked about last session and this session. They're working harder. You don't want them working harder. Giving them a greater chance of learning little or misinterpreting parts or the whole of your project. Folks, things layer and nest like a bunch of Matryoshka dolls. Hopefully you know what Matryoshka dolls are, right? Nesting dolls. And we talked a little bit about this, right? Whoops. Sentences form paragraphs. Paragraphs connect, however many you need, right? To form sections. Sections connect. How do sections connect? With good transitions and then what? Good section titles, headings, so on. And it all does what? Forms your proposal, the larger arc. The story is a set of nested arcs. You could read those, right? It's basically just reinforcing. And remember, I've mentioned this before, the sentence is the fundamental building block of stories. It's where everything begins. Yeah, you got to put sentences together to form a paragraph, right? Because if you have a bunch of sentences and say that's a paragraph and they don't connect, they don't develop anything, they don't tell a story, that's not a paragraph, right? If I said something like, what's your full name?
My full name?
Yeah.
Carrie Cutter Bowen.
Right. If I like Harry Cutter Bowen's tattoos and I say, I like Harry Cutter Bowen's tattoos, the walls are beige, my tummy hurts, I have 3 sentences. That ain't a paragraph, right? No connection, right? That kind of thing. Certainly no development. Development towards what? My tummy hurts, right? How do I get from I like the tattoos, which you think, okay, he likes them, to my stomach hurts, right? It doesn't make sense. All of this connects, right, together. Remember, what goes here, the last part of your sentence, what Gopin calls the stress position, is new information. The new information then does what? Whatever it may be, then sets up the next sentence. Okay? That's how you're building those connections, right? So if I said, I won't use your full name this time. I like Harry's tattoos. The particular tattoo on her left arm is very interesting, right? I need to ask Harry who her tattoo artist is, right? Connecting, fully developed story. A lot of this you're probably anticipating, right? And I've mentioned it. Paragraphs use these story structures. Or maybe you're coming up with your own structure. Who knows, right? But I'm giving you 4 sample ones. You'll want to primarily use bluff approach when writing paragraphs, right? In other words, you want to let them know what the main point of the paragraph is right up front, right? While the overall structure of a proposal usually can take an OCAR form, the paragraphs appearing in the sections can use any number of structures, right? Again, these are not hard and fast rules. These are guidelines, right? Here's an alternative structure that I'll let you ruminate about. It's called LDRT, right? It's right. The line, bottom line or point first, you develop it, there's resolution, and then the only thing I'm really adding here, folks, is this T to emphasize that paragraphs need transitions, okay? Then your end, a sentence which broaches the topic of the next paragraph such that a reader knows its connection to what was just discussed, right? If anything, whatever structure, right, LDRT, because you want to emphasize you have to write transitions, or OCAR or ABDCE or LD, right, LDR, remember, you need these transitions. You need a way to very softly move a reader from one paragraph to another. You need a smooth connection, right? It's like if you're moving a sleeping child. I don't know how many other people have had to move a sleeping child, right? I have, okay? It's like defusing a bomb, right? You know, if you're, or a sleeping animal for that matter, right? If like you got a cat in your lap and you're like, I got to go to the bathroom, but I don't want to disturb the cat, right? You do it gently, right? It's not a jarring experience, right? Because if it's a jarring experience for the kid, guess what? The rest of your free time for the night is probably blown, right? These transitions should not be jarring either, right? Remember back, your tattoos are going to now become famous. Remember back to the Becca's tattoos example. If I talk about at the last sentence, I need to ask Becca who her tattoo artist is, right? You know, you may be thinking, well, maybe now he's going to talk about tattoo artists, or maybe, you know, so on. If I say next sentence, new paragraph, my tummy hurts, you'll be thinking, whoa, how do these connect, right? That's a very jarring transition. You're not given any clue, right? Any, if you want to say foreshadowing, although it's clearer than foreshadowing, right? From the previous paragraph's last sentence, which was talking about tattoo artists. The natural transition, right? The natural expectation of what? You as readers, because that's why you're like, that tummy thing doesn't make sense, is to be like, what? He talked about tattoo artists in the last sentence of the last paragraph. What should I expect? Something about tattoo artists, right? It could be, so on Thursday, I asked Becca about her tattoo artist, right? Or it could be, that reminds me that a good tattoo artist is very important to have, right? Or whatever. I'm not necessarily pro tattoo, but I like tattoos. Okay. Right? And I kind of said that. It's basically LDRT. These common problems. I thought I had one more problem. Well, personally, I have many more problems, but I thought I had one more problem on this slide. If you are reading something that you've written, and let me tell you, one of the best ways to figure out if what you have written is making sense is you read it back to yourself out loud. Push comes to shove, record yourself, and then listen to yourself reading it, right? If something's not working, look to these. The topic isn't clear. Where's the topic coming? Either at the beginning of a sentence, or if we're talking about the paragraph, something's wrong in that first sentence of the paragraph, right? Where your topic sentence usually goes. There are too many topics. In other words, if I started one sentence talking about Becca's tattoos, comfortable chairs, and, you know, chocolate chip cookies, right? The reader's expecting, one, I got to talk about all those things in the rest of the paragraph, right? But also, possibly more importantly, the reader's also thinking, all right, these are going to tie together somehow, right? Sometimes it's possible to introduce too many ideas in a paragraph, okay? In other words, it's like, you want to do 15 activities over your vacation. You have 7 days. If you want to do 13 of the activities, I forgot how many activities, but I think there were at least 13. If you want to do 13 of your activities on the first day, guess what? That's a lot to pack into one day, right? You might be able to do it. Is it going to be fun? No, right? Introducing multiple topics, you're giving the reader that kind of same feeling, which is, gosh, there's a lot that's going to happen here. Remember, you've got to make it pay off. When you introduce a topic, you're making, if you will, a promise to the reader that you're going to develop it, and you're going to develop it well. Too many topics means you've got to develop all the topics and develop them well. That attempts to do that usually lead to big, long, like page-long paragraphs. Never good, right? Your sentence structuring is haphazard. Remember, where should the stress position go? What's in the stress position? The resolution is absent. Even on the individual sentence level, there needs to be a point or takeaway. Definitely needs to be one in paragraphs. And obviously, transitions clear or unclear. You're building a house, overused, right? Overused example, but you are building a house. Now, this may be like the third payoff slide. If you remember to the first session, when I said, these are the key questions your proposal must answer. And some of you were like, well, that's a lot of stuff. My question to you now is, now that you saw this at the beginning, and now you see this at the end, after discussing some of the things that we've discussed, do you feel more confident in tackling this list than you did before you even took the seminar, right? I mean, even if you feel a little bit confident, I'm not saying you think you're going to be a key, awesome ace proposal writer from here on in. That usually doesn't happen, right? But if you can look at these now and think, all right, I've got at least a handle on how I can go about this, then you're better off than you were, right? You're better off than you were. It takes practice, it takes other people and so on, but you can do it. You can do it. Remember back to the remember the stupid uromycetitis example. If I can write a bunch of nonsense and make it somehow like logically stand together and kind of make sense, you who know your stuff, who are experts in your field, right? Who big people who are far more important than me probably come to and consult with you, right? You can do it, right? And remember, right? That's a biggie. They're always wanting to know how you're going to be able to go forward in your research career once you successfully complete the project. How do you do these? I mentioned a lot of these. How do you answer these questions? It takes time. Write each question on a single page, the ones we just saw. Dedicate a portion of the page to identifying the relationship between this question and the others. Start small. Answer using 2 or 3 sentences. How do I answer something in 2 or 3 sentences? Look to your structures, right? Your paragraph structures, LDR, LD, or so on. Trying to write it in 2 or 3 sentences will also help you do what? Help you start developing that, here's my bottom line, and I'm getting to it as soon as possible. This is also important. And we talked about this the last session. You need to be clear, and you need to write not only for people who are in your field and maybe in your particular area, but also for people who are not in your area, right? That means you have to write to a mixed audience, right? You're obviously not writing to like little JoJo who's in 3rd grade, right? We're talking about proposals getting funded. Although at the rate things are going, you may have little JoJo in 3rd grade deciding whether your proposals get funded, right? So you're going to have to use terms, key terms, technical terms. You need to think about before you start writing, think about what are the terms that I know my audience in general will not know, right? What are the terms I must use in order to make sure that the people in my field or in my particular area even, that I need to use to show them that I know what I'm talking about, right? Develop a list of those as well and see where they'll need to plug in. See where it's unavoidable that you have to use a technical term that somebody else might not know, excuse me. And that way, at that point, you'll need to give a 1-sentence explanation, that kind of stuff. And then once you do this, start expanding your answers, right? Is this the only way? No, it's a way, right? It's a way. Additional resources are here, okay? And some of you talked about in the survey, well, what really is the difference between academic journal writing and proposal writing? You can't really read these, but Bob Porter, right, has written an article, right? I actually worked with Bob. Bob wrote a whole article about how the differences between journal articles and proposal writing. You can find, and I believe these are still live linked. If not, I can get you these links. Becca will hold my head underwater until I give them to her. Science of Scientific Writing, okay, is an article by Gopin and Swan. As you already were able to tell, Gopin can be a little long-winded, like me. However, right, it is good, and you're hearing it straight from the Gopin's mouth, the horse's mouth, all right? There is Josh Schimmel's book, Writing Science, which I mentioned last time. Get it used if you can, it's cheaper. There is also online somewhere, and if need be, I can give the links. Somebody, and I want to say it was like NOAA or some weather-related federal agency, invited Schimmel to give a 3-part presentation solely about this book. Okay? You can watch that. A lot of it will be similar. Why? I got to learn it from somebody, right? Schimmel's one of the people I learned it from. This, Dr. Agata Brancic, okay? She has a YouTube course on scientific writing. You'll see that she's cited a number of times. She is good. You may look at it and go, I wish she did this instead of this Mazzicola guy, right? But she's good to help reinforce things. Then Gopin has written a book called The Sense of Structure, where she goes really in depth into the paragraph structure and reader expectations and so on. If I had to answer a question, well, what do I look at first, Jim? I would say this Porter article, either the course in scientific writing or the science of scientific writing, then writing science. I'd hit that one last. Okay? Hit that one last. And I think that's it.